I want her." Victor DeLuca said those 3 words while a young woman's future was still hanging in the balance, and he said them the way other men order wine without asking, without doubt, without a single flicker of concern for what she might want. He had already decided. He had already reached into her life and started rearranging it before she even knew his name. That is the kind of man he was, and Emily Carter had no idea that one sentence spoken across a crowded restaurant had just taken her freedom. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, please subscribe to the channel and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end. And in the comments, tell me the city you're watching from. I truly love seeing how far these stories travel. Emily Carter carried 4 plates on one arm and a secret in her chest, and on most nights she couldn't tell you which one was heavier. The restaurant was called Bella Nera, and it sat on a quiet corner in Manhattan where the money was old and the tips were unpredictable. Emily had worked there for 2 years. 2 years of aching feet of memorizing wine lists she could never afford to taste, of smiling at men who looked through her like she was a piece of the furniture. She was 26. She was a law student by day and a ghost by night, and she had learned a long time ago that in a place like this, the smartest thing a woman could do was disappear. "Table 9 wants their check," said Marco, the floor manager, sliding past her with a tray. "And table 12 is complaining the risotto is cold." "It's not cold," Emily said quietly. "They ordered it that way. They asked for it lukewarm because the old man has a sensitive stomach." Marco stopped. He looked at her the way people always looked at her when she said something too precise, too observant, too much. "How do you even know that?" "Because I listen," Emily said, and she moved on before he could ask anything else. That was the problem with Emily Carter. She listened, she noticed, she understood things she was never supposed to understand. And the hardest part of her job wasn't the standing or the shouting or the exhaustion that settled into her bones by midnight. The hardest part was pretending she didn't. Her grandmother had raised her in a small apartment in Queens, and her grandmother had spoken to her only in Italian. Not the tourist book Italian, not the phrases printed on menus, but the real thing, the fast, warm, musical Italian of a woman who had crossed an ocean with nothing and built a life out of stubbornness. By the time Emily was 10, she was fluent. By the time she was 15, she'd taught herself Russian too, because the family next door spoke it, and she'd been a lonely child who wanted to be understood by everyone. But her grandmother had also taught her a rule Emily had never broken. "Piccola," the old woman used to say, holding Emily's face in her hands. "In this country, a woman who is too clever frightens people. And frightened people take things away from you. Keep your mind quiet. Let them think you are simple. Your mind is your treasure. You do not show your treasure to thieves." So Emily kept it quiet. She served the risotto and refilled the water glasses and let the wealthy men at the good tables assume she was exactly what she appeared to be, a tired girl earning tips. But that night, everything changed. And it changed because of a family from Milan who couldn't read the menu. They were tourists, clearly. A mother, a father, and 2 teenage boys, all of them squinting at the leather-bound menu and speaking to each other in rapid, frustrated Italian. The father kept gesturing at the waiter, a young man named Danny, and Danny kept nodding with the frozen, panicked smile of a person who understood nothing. "They're asking if the seafood is fresh," Emily said, appearing at Danny's elbow, "and whether the pasta has egg in it because the younger boy has an allergy." Danny turned to her, relieved. "You speak Italian." And here was the moment. Here was the moment where Emily should have said just a little and translated only what was necessary and slipped back into the shadows where she belonged. But she was tired. She was so tired that night, and the mother's face was so anxious, so much like her grandmother's face, that something in Emily simply gave way. She turned to the family and she spoke. Not a little, not carefully. She spoke in a river of warm, effortless Italian, telling them the seafood came in that morning, that the chef could make the pasta fresh without egg, that the boy would be perfectly safe, that they had chosen a beautiful restaurant, and she would take good care of them. The mother's whole body relaxed. The father laughed. The younger boy grinned at her like she had personally saved his life. And the entire section of the restaurant went quiet. Emily didn't notice at first. She was still talking, still smiling, still being for one reckless moment herself. The couple at the next table had stopped their conversation. A businessman near the window had lowered his phone. The music seemed to shrink. And in the corner of the room at the best table in the house, a man who had been lifting a glass of red wine to his lips set the glass back down without drinking. His name was Victor DeLuca. He was perhaps 45, though it was hard to say, because he was the kind of man who seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. He wore a dark suit that cost more than Emily made in a year, and he wore it like a second skin. His hair was going silver at the temples. His face gave away nothing. He had the stillness of a man who never needed to hurry because the world had always waited for him. And he was watching Emily Carter with an expression she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. Beside him sat a heavier man, older, with a scar across one eyebrow, an associate, a shadow. Victor did not look away from Emily as he leaned slightly toward this man. He did not lower his voice as much as he could have. Perhaps he wanted her to feel it even from across the room. "I want her," he said. The associate followed his gaze. "The waitress." "Not the waitress." Victor finally lifted the wine again, and this time he drank. "The one who's been pretending to be one." Emily finished with the Milan family. She wrote down their order. And when she straightened up and turned back toward the kitchen, she felt it, the weight of eyes. She scanned the room the way she always did, out of instinct, out of survival. And she found him. Their eyes met. It lasted less than a second. But in that second, Emily felt something cold move through her, a warning she couldn't name. The man in the corner was not looking at her the way the other men looked at her. He was not undressing her or dismissing her or pitying her. He was studying her, calculating, as if she were a problem he had just realized was worth solving. She broke the gaze and hurried into the kitchen, and her hands were shaking as she clipped the order to the wheel. "You okay?" Danny asked. "Fine," she said. "Who is that?" "The man in the corner. Dark suit." Danny leaned around the corner to look, then pulled back fast, and his face had gone pale. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't stare at him." "Why, who is he?" "I don't know his name, but I know Marco practically had a heart attack when he walked in. Free table, free everything. Nobody's allowed to give him a check." Danny swallowed. "Guys like that, Emily, you serve them and you forget you ever saw them. Trust me." Emily nodded slowly, but she could still feel it, that cold thread running down her spine. She told herself it was nothing. A rich man had heard her speak Italian and been surprised. That was all. Rich men were surprised by things all the time. She got through the rest of her shift. She kept her head down. And when the man in the dark suit finally rose to leave, he did not summon her, did not tip her, did not so much as glance in her direction again. He simply walked out into the New York night with his shadow trailing behind him, and Emily let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. He was gone. It was over. She was so wrong. The next morning, Emily sat in a lecture hall trying to focus on contract law and failing. She hadn't slept. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd seen that face, that stillness, those calculating eyes. She kept telling herself she was being ridiculous. "Ms. Carter." The professor's voice cut across the room. "Perhaps you'd like to explain the concept of duress to us, since you seem to be somewhere else entirely." A few students snickered. Emily straightened. "Duress," she said, "is when a person is forced into an agreement through threats or pressure that overcome their free will. A contract signed under duress isn't truly voluntary, and the law doesn't recognize it as binding, because consent given under coercion isn't really consent at all." The professor raised an eyebrow, mildly impressed. "Very good. Wide awake after all." Emily gave a small smile. She had no idea in that moment how personally she was about to learn the meaning of that word. She worked again that night, and around 9 o'clock, as the dinner rush thinned, Marco came to find her, and his face was strange, tight, nervous in a way she had never seen. "Emily, come with me. Now." "What's wrong? Did I do something?" "Just come." He led her not to this kitchen, not to the office, but toward the private dining room at the back, the room reserved for the kind of guests who didn't want to be seen. Emily's heart began to pound. Marco stopped at the door. "He asked for you," Marco said quietly. "Who did?" Marco didn't answer. He just opened the door. Victor DeLuca sat alone at the long table, a single glass of wine in front of him, and the room felt colder for his presence. He looked up when Emily entered, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Sit down, Ms. Carter," he said. She didn't move. "How do you know my name?" Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I know a great deal about you. Please, sit." Emily glanced back at Marco, but Marco had already stepped out and closed the door. She was alone with him. Her every instinct told her to leave, and yet her feet carried her to the chair across from him, and she sat because some part of her understood that men like this were not refused. "You're afraid of me," Victor observed. "Should I be? That depends entirely on you." He turned the wine glass slowly by its stem. "Last night you spoke Italian to a family from Milan, fluently, beautifully, not the Italian of a class you took, the Italian of a home." "My grandmother," Emily said before she could stop herself. "Yes, Rosa Carter. Born in Naples, immigrated in 1961, worked as a seamstress until her hands gave out. She raised you after your mother died. You were 7. He said it all without a single note of drama, the way another man might read a grocery list. "She taught you Italian, and I suspect she taught you something else how to hide it." Emily's blood had gone to ice. "How do you know that?" "Because I make it my business to know things about people who interest me." He leaned back. "You're a second-year law student. Top 10% of your class, though you keep it quiet the same way you keep your languages quiet. You're $40,000 in debt. Your grandmother's medical bills before she passed took everything she had, and most of what you had, too. You work 5 nights a week here, and you still can't cover next semester's tuition." His eyes held hers. "You are drowning, Ms. Carter. Quietly. Politely, but drowning." Emily's throat was tight. Every word he'd spoken was true, and the truth of it was a violation, a hand reaching into her chest. "Why are you telling me this?" she managed. "Because I want to offer you a way out." And there it was. The offer. She would remember later how gentle it sounded, how reasonable. "I run a number of businesses," Victor said. "Real estate, import and export. Hospitality, this restaurant, in fact, and 11 others like it. I own Bellanera, Ms. Carter. I own the floor you've been standing on for 2 years. He let that settle. "My operations are international. I need someone who can move between worlds, someone who can sit in a room full of dangerous, clever people and understand not just their words, but their meaning. Someone with legal training, someone with languages, someone with a mind." He tilted his head. "Someone like you. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a life, a position as my personal assistant. Your salary would be 3 times what you make now after tips. I would cover the remainder of your law degree in full, and I would introduce you to a world you have only ever watched from a distance, holding a tray." For a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. It was everything. Every problem she had solved in a single sentence. The debt, the tuition, the endless, exhausting math of her survival gone. It was salvation. And that was exactly why she didn't trust it. "Why me?" she said. "You don't know me. You watched me speak Italian one time. That doesn't tell you I can do any of what you're describing." "It tells me everything," Victor said. "It tells me you're intelligent enough to be valuable and disciplined enough to hide it. It tells me you understand something most people never learn, that the ones who reveal their strength are the first to lose it." He almost smiled again. "You've been surviving in disguise your whole life, Miss Carter. I'm simply offering you a better costume." Emily sat very still, and then she asked the question that mattered. "What kind of businesses require someone who can negotiate with dangerous people?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Victor did not look away. "The profitable kind," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Emily stood up. Her legs were shaking, but her voice somehow was steady. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. DeLuca, but I think I'd like to earn my degree the hard way, the way I've been earning everything." She turned toward the door. "I'll send Marco in to clear your table." "Miss Carter." She stopped. She shouldn't have, but something in his voice stopped her. "I admire that you said no," Victor said quietly. "It confirms my judgment. A person who accepts too easily is a person with no self-worth, and I have no use for those." He turned his glass again. "But I should tell you something in the interest of honesty. I contacted your law school this morning. Emily's hand froze on the doorknob. You did what? I've endowed a scholarship there. Anonymous, of course. And I've made certain arrangements. Your class schedule has been adjusted to accommodate a working position. Your account with the bursar has been flagged for review. He paused. None of it is finalized. It requires your acceptance. But I wanted you to understand that the doors are already open. All you have to do is walk through. Emily turned around slowly. Her face had gone white with something that was no longer fear. It was closer to fury. You changed my schedule, she said. Before I even said yes, you went into my life and you started moving things around like I was already yours. I removed obstacles. You removed my choice. Victor regarded her calmly. Did I, or did I simply show you how few choices you truly had to begin with? He stood and he was taller than she'd realized, and the room seemed smaller with him on his feet. You'll be back here again tomorrow night, Ms. Carter carrying plates aching counting tips that won't be enough. And the night after that, and the night after that, until your body gives out or your debt swallows you whole. His voice was almost gentle. I'm not taking your choice. I'm the only real choice you've ever been given. Emily walked out. She didn't send Marco to clear the table. She grabbed her coat, told him she was sick, and left an hour before the end of her shift, and she walked 40 blocks in the cold because she couldn't stand the thought of sitting still on a train. A contract signed under duress isn't truly voluntary. Her own words from that morning circled her like vultures. Consent given under coercion isn't really consent at all. She knew what he was. She wasn't a fool. A man who owned 12 restaurants and knew a stranger's grandmother's date of immigration, who spoke of dangerous people as business associates, who reached into a law school and rearranged a student's life overnight. A man like that did not make his fortune selling risotto. She knew. And she told herself walking through the freezing dark that she would never say yes. But by the time she reached her apartment, she had checked her mail. And in her mailbox was a letter from the bursar's office, a final notice. Her tuition balance was due in 11 days, and if it went unpaid, her enrollment would be suspended. 11 days. She had $240 in her account and a rent check that hadn't cleared yet. Emily sat down on the floor of her tiny apartment in her coat in the cold, and she stared at that letter until the words blurred. Everything she had worked for, everything her grandmother had sacrificed for, 3 years of night shifts and no sleep and no life, all of it hanging by a thread 11 days long. And somewhere across the city, a man in a dark suit was waiting, having already guessed exactly how this would end. She didn't sleep that night either. She went to class the next morning and she couldn't hear a word of it. She thought about her grandmother's hands ruined by decades of sewing. She thought about the way Rosa had scrimped and saved and gone without so that Emily could have a future. Keep your mind quiet. Your mind is your treasure. You do not show your treasure to thieves. But what did you do? Emily wondered, when the thief already knew your treasure, when he'd already seen it, already priced it, already offered to buy it. What did you do when saying no meant losing everything the treasure was supposed to protect? She thought she understood duress now, really understood it. It wasn't a gun to the head. It was quieter than that. It was a man who arranged the world so that the wrong choice looked like the only sane one. It was drowning slowly while someone stood on the shore, holding out a hand, and the price of that hand was your whole soul. That evening she didn't go to Bellinera. She went to the address on the card that Marco had wordlessly slipped into her apron the night before, a card she had told herself she'd thrown away and hadn't. A tower of glass and steel in Midtown so tall it seemed to scrape the underside of the clouds. She gave her name at the desk, and the security guard didn't even check a list. He just nodded as if he'd been told to expect her, as if her arrival had been a foregone conclusion. Of course it had. The elevator carried her up 40 floors in silence. The doors opened onto a reception area of dark marble and soft light, and a woman with a headset looked up and smiled without surprise. Ms. Carter, he's expecting you, right this way. Victor DeLuca's office was enormous, all windows, the city spread out below him like something he owned. He stood when she entered. He did not look triumphant. That was the strange part. He looked, if anything, almost respectful. You came, he said. You knew I would. I hoped you would. There's a difference. He gestured to a chair. Please. Emily didn't sit. I have conditions. That seemed to interest him. Go on. I finished my degree. Not a fake degree, not a bought one, a real one, my own work, my own exams. You don't interfere with my grades or my professors. That's not negotiable. Agreed. I want everything in writing. The salary, the tuition, the terms, a real contract. I'm a law student, Mr. DeLuca. I don't sign things I haven't read. Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe. Agreed. And I want to know what I'm walking into. Emily's voice didn't waver, though her heart was slamming against her ribs. Not the profitable kind. The truth. What are your businesses, really? Victor was quiet for a long moment. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, his hands clasped behind his back. I can't tell you that yet, he said. Not because I'm hiding it, but because you're not ready to hear it, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Some doors, Miss Carter, only open one way. He turned to face her. But I'll make you a promise. I will never lie to you. I may not tell you everything, not at first, but I will never lie to you. That's more than most people in your life have ever offered. And the terrible thing Emily realized was that he was right. Her professors lied to her about her prospects. The world lied to her about fairness. Even her grandmother. God, rest her, had lied to her about the safety of staying small and quiet. This man was offering her the truth in installments, and a way out of drowning, and the only price was everything she'd ever believed about who she was. Why did you really choose me? She asked one last time softly. The real reason. Victor DeLuca looked at her for a long time. Because when you spoke that language, he said, I saw a woman who had spent her whole life making herself smaller than she was, hiding, apologizing for her own mind. His voice dropped. I've built an empire, Miss Carter. I have money and power and men who would die at a word from me, but I have spent 30 years surrounded by people who are exactly as large as they appear and not 1 inch more. And you were the opposite. You were an ocean pretending to be a puddle. He almost smiled. I don't want a waitress. I don't even want an assistant. I want to see what you become when you finally stop hiding. The office was silent. 40 floors below the city moved on indifferent, and somewhere out there was a small apartment with a final notice on the floor, and a grandmother's ghost, and a girl who had been drowning politely for years. Emily Carter thought about the word duress. She thought about consent given under coercion, and whether a choice made at the bottom of an ocean was truly a choice at all. And then she extended her hand. Show me the contract, she said. Victor DeLuca shook her hand, and his grip was warm and firm and final, and Emily felt the last door of her old life swing quietly shut behind her. Welcome, Miss Carter, he said, to the world you were always meant to see. She didn't know it yet, but she had just agreed to more than a job. She had agreed to be remade. And somewhere down the line, in a room full of armed men and screaming and gunfire, she would discover exactly what Victor DeLuca had seen in her that first night, and exactly how far an ocean pretending to be a puddle could go once it finally stopped pretending, but that was still to come. For now, there was only the contract on the desk, and the pen in her hand, and the strange, dizzying feeling of a life ending, and another one beginning in the very same breath. Emily read every word. She read it twice, and when she finally signed her name, her hand was steady, and her grandmother's voice was very far away, and the city below her looked for the first time in her life like something she might one day reach out and touch. She had no way of knowing that the man watching her sign was already thinking about the next move, and the one after that, and the one after that, a whole long game unfolding in his mind with Emily Carter at the center of it. She thought she had negotiated. She thought she had set the terms. She had no idea that Victor DeLuca never made an offer he hadn't already won. The contract was 17 pages long, and Emily Carter read every single one of them at her kitchen table. That first night, a cup of cold coffee beside her, her grandmother's old reading glasses perched on her nose. She had signed it in Victor's office, yes, but she had insisted on taking a copy home, and she had spent 4 hours going through it line by line, searching for the trap she was certain had to be hidden somewhere in the language. She couldn't find it. That was what frightened her most. The contract was clean. The salary was exactly what he'd promised 3 times, her old income paid bi-weekly with a signing bonus that had already cleared her tuition debt in a single afternoon. The tuition clause was airtight in her favor. There was even a provision that let her terminate the arrangement with 30 days' notice, no penalty, no strings. On paper, Victor DeLuca had given her everything and asked for nothing but her time and her mind. And Emily knew the way. You know a storm is coming before the first cloud appears, that the real contract was not written on any of those 17 pages. The real contract was written in the spaces between the words. It was written in what he hadn't told her. It was written in the phrase he'd used in his office, the one that kept circling back to her in the dark: some doors only open one way. She took the job anyway, because the alternative was drowning, and she had spent too many years already learning to hold her breath. Her first morning began at 7 o'clock when a black car arrived outside her apartment building. She hadn't ordered a car. She hadn't been told there would be one. But there it was, engine running, and a driver named Anton, who nodded at her like they'd known each other for years. "Ms. Carter," he said, opening the door, "Mr. DeLuca is expecting you at 9, but he thought you might want to stop somewhere first." "Stop where?" Anton didn't answer. He just drove. And 20 minutes later, the car pulled up outside a boutique on Madison Avenue, the kind of place where the clothes had no price tags, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford them. A woman was waiting at the door. "Miss Carter, I'm Celeste. Mr. DeLuca has arranged a wardrobe for you." Emily stood on the sidewalk in her one good coat, the one she'd bought secondhand, and she felt something harden in her chest. "I didn't ask for a wardrobe." "No," Celeste said pleasantly. "You didn't. But you can't walk into the rooms you're about to walk into dressed like a law student. It isn't about vanity, Miss Carter. It's about survival. In those rooms, people read your clothes before they hear your words. Mr. DeLuca simply wants them to read the truth." Emily stood there for a long moment, and then she understood the lesson buried in the gesture the same way she'd understood the risotto. This wasn't a gift. It was a message. You belong to a different world now, and you will look the part whether you ask to or not. Victor DeLuca was not going to force her into anything. He was simply going to keep opening doors one after another until she forgot she had ever wanted to stay outside. She went in, she let them dress her. And when she looked at herself in the mirror an hour later in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been sewn onto her body, her hair pulled back, her whole self transformed into something sharp and expensive and unfamiliar. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. And the terrifying part was how much she liked her. By 9 o'clock, she was back in the glass tower, riding the elevator up 40 floors, and when the doors opened, Victor was waiting. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the transformation, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. Confirmation. "There she is," he said quietly. "There who is. The woman I saw across the restaurant." He turned and began to walk, and she fell into step beside him. "Come. You have a great deal to learn, and I don't intend to waste your first day." What followed were the strangest weeks of Emily Carter's life. She learned the shape of Victor DeLuca's empire, the way you learn the shape of a house in the dark, by touching one wall at a time, never seeing the whole. On the surface, it was exactly what he'd said: real estate, restaurants, import and export. She sat in on legitimate meetings with legitimate men in suits, and she reviewed contracts and leases and shipping manifests, and for the first 2 weeks, she almost let herself believe that maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe he really was just a very rich, very ruthless businessman, and her imagination had invented monsters where there were only spreadsheets. Then came the meeting on the 14th day, and the illusion cracked. It was late past 10 at night, and Victor called her into a conference room she'd never been in before, smaller, windowless, with a heavy door that sealed with a sound like a bank vault. 3 men were already seated. They did not look like businessmen. One of them had a tattoo climbing up the side of his neck. Another kept a phone on the table that he glanced at every 30 seconds. They spoke in Italian fast and low, and they clearly assumed the American girl in the corner understood nothing. They were wrong. Emily kept her face perfectly blank, her grandmother's training rising up in her like a reflex, and she listened. And what she heard made her stomach turn to ice. They weren't talking about shipping containers full of wine. They were talking about what was hidden inside the shipping containers. They were talking about a shipment that had been seized at the port, and a customs official who had asked for more money, and a problem a man, someone named Ricci, who had been talking to people he shouldn't have been talking to. They discussed this last problem the way other men discussed a broken appliance. Something to be dealt with, something to be removed. Emily sat in the corner and translated it all in her head and understood with absolute clarity exactly what she had signed her name to. Victor watched her the entire time. Not the men, her. He was watching to see what she would do, whether her face would crack, whether she would flinch, whether she would give herself away. And Emily, who had spent her whole life hiding her mind from thieves, gave him nothing. She sat perfectly still, took her notes in careful legal shorthand, and let no flicker of understanding cross her features. When the men left, Victor closed the vault door and turned to her. "You understood every word," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Emily said. There was no point lying. He'd known she was fluent. He'd probably arranged the meeting precisely to test her. And Emily set down her pen. Her hands, she was proud to notice, were steady. "And I understand now why you couldn't tell me in your office. You were right. Some doors only open one way." She looked up at him. "That man, Ricci, you're going to have him killed." The words hung in the sealed room. Victor didn't blink. "Does that frighten you?" "It should," Emily said slowly. "That's what frightens me, that it doesn't as much as it should." She stood up. 6 weeks ago, I would have run out of this building screaming. And instead, I'm sitting here calculating, wondering what he did, wondering whether there's a version of this where nobody has to die. And I hate that I'm wondering. I hate that some part of me has already started thinking like you. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, and when he spoke, there was something almost human in his voice. "Ricci has been informing to a federal task force for 8 months, he said. He's given them names. Some of those names belong to men who trusted him, men with families. If Ricci keeps talking, those men go to prison for the rest of their lives, and their children grow up visiting them through glass. That's the reality, Miss Carter. Not a movie, not a simple story of good and evil. A man betrayed people who trusted him, and now there's a price. And the price is terrible, and I am the one who has to pay it." He looked at her. "I don't enjoy it. I want you to understand that. Anyone who enjoys it is a monster, and I've buried my share of monsters. But I do it because in my world, mercy to one man is a death sentence for 10 others. And that makes it right." "No," Victor said simply. "It makes it necessary. Right and necessary are almost never the same thing. That's the first real lesson of the world you've entered. The sooner you learn it, the longer you'll live." Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat in her expensive new apartment because of course he'd moved her. Of course there'd been a better apartment waiting closer to the office. The rent quietly handled, and she stared at the ceiling and waited to feel horror. Real horror. The kind that would send her running for the 30-day termination clause. It didn't come. What came instead was something far more disturbing. Understanding. She kept turning Victor's words over in her mind, testing them, the way she tested a legal argument, looking for the flaw, and she couldn't find the clean answer she wanted. She thought about the men with families. She thought about children visiting their fathers through glass. She thought about how the law, she was studying the law she loved, would have sent all of them to prison and called it justice, and how Victor's answer was monstrous and also in some cold and terrible way protective. And she realized her grandmother had been wrong about one thing. It wasn't enough to keep your mind quiet and hide from the thieves. Because sometimes the thieves came for you anyway, and then the only thing that could save you was a mind sharp enough to survive them. She was learning to survive them. And she wasn't sure she'd survive what it was turning her into. 3 days later, she learned that Ricci had disappeared. No body, no news. Just a name that stopped being mentioned, a chair that stopped being filled. And Emily said nothing and took her notes and went home and understood that her silence had made her part of it. Not a witness, a participant. That was the moment she stopped being able to pretend she was only visiting. The weeks turned into months and Emily Carter changed, and the change was so gradual she barely felt it happening. She still went to class. She still earned her grades honestly, just as she'd demanded. But the classroom felt smaller now, more like a game she was playing than a life she was living. In the lecture hall, she learned the law as it was written. In Victor's world, she learned the law as it actually worked. Who could be bought, who could be threatened, which judges owed favors, and which prosecutors had secrets. how power moved beneath the surface of a city while ordinary people walked around on top of it never knowing. And she was good at it. That was the thing she could no longer deny. She was frighteningly good at it. She had a gift Victor's prized above all others. She could sit in a room full of people speaking 3 languages and understand not just their words, but the fear beneath their words, the lie beneath their confidence, the deal that could be made beneath the deal that was being refused. She started catching things Victor's other people missed. A tremor in a supplier's voice that meant he was skimming. A phrase in a contract that meant a partner was planning to betray them. She became his eyes and his ears in rooms where a single misread signal could get someone killed. "You see them," Victor told her one evening after she'd flagged a business partner's deception that had saved him a fortune. "The way I do. Most people look at a person and see a surface. You look at a person and see the whole architecture, where the weight is, where it'll break." "My grandmother taught me," Emily said. "She used to say you could tell everything about a person by what they were pretending not to feel." A wise woman. "She'd have hated you," Emily said, but there was no venom in it anymore, and that scared her more than venom would have. Victor almost smiled. "Yes, I imagine she would have." Their relationship shifted in those months into something Emily couldn't name. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't romance, not yet, though she'd have been lying if she said the thought never crossed her mind in the small hours. It was something stranger, a partnership between 2 people who saw the world the same way, who spoke the same silent language of observation and calculation. Victor talked to her the way she suspected he talked to no one else. He told her things. Not everything, never everything, but pieces. And she found herself waiting for those pieces, hungry for them, hungry to understand the man who had reached into her life and rearranged it. She learned that he'd grown up poor in Brooklyn, the son of an immigrant who'd been crushed by men exactly like the man Victor had become. She learned that he'd built his empire not out of greed, but out of a cold, unrelenting refusal to ever be powerless again. She learned that he'd been married once long ago, and that his wife had died, and that he never spoke of how, and that the silence around that death was the one wall in him she couldn't see behind. "You ask a lot of questions," he told her one night in the car after a meeting that had run past midnight. "You hired me for my mind. You can't be surprised that it's curious." "I'm not surprised. I'm careful." He looked out the window at the passing city. "The last person who knew as much about me as you're starting to know is dead, Ms. Carter. I'd prefer you not join her." Emily's breath caught. "Is that a threat?" "No," Victor said, and he turned to look at her, and for once his face was completely open, and what she saw in it was something she'd never expected. Fear. Not of her, for her. "It's a warning. There are people in my world who would use you to get to me, who would hurt you simply because you matter to me. And you're starting to matter to me, Ms. Carter, which is inconvenient because the things I care about are the things my enemies aim at." He looked away again. "So be careful. Not for my sake, for your own." Emily sat with that in the dark of the car, her heart doing something complicated. And she understood that a line had just been crossed and that neither of them was going to name it. The next several weeks moved fast. Victor began taking her everywhere. Galas where senators drank champagne beside men whose fortunes had no paper trail. Private dinners where a handshake moved more money than most people saw in a lifetime. She learned to read a room in an instant, who had power and who only pretended to who was afraid, and hiding it who was dangerous and hiding it better. She learned to speak without saying anything to smile while calculating to be underestimated and to use it. And she was good. Everyone said so. Victor's associates who had eyed her with suspicion, at first the law student, the outsider, the woman the boss had plucked from a restaurant, began to treat her with wary respect, because she never made a mistake, because she caught the things they missed, because when she spoke in whatever language the moment required, people listened. But underneath the growing confidence, underneath the expensive suits and the elite rooms, Emily Carter was fighting a quiet war with herself. Because every day she stayed, she felt her old life getting further away. The girl who'd carried plates at Bellinera, the granddaughter who'd promised Rosa she'd become a lawyer to help people. That girl was fading, and in her place was becoming someone Emily wasn't sure she recognized. Someone comfortable in rooms full of dangerous men. Someone who could hear a man's death discussed and simply take notes. She called her old roommate once, a woman named Sarah who'd known her before all this. They met for coffee, and halfway through, Sarah stopped talking and just looked at her. "What?" Emily said. "You're different," Sarah said slowly. "The way you carry yourself. The way you look at me like you're, I don't know, reading me. You never used to do that." She hesitated. "Emily, this job, this man you're working for, are you okay? Are you safe?" And Emily opened her mouth to say yes, of course, everything's fine, and found she couldn't say it, because it wasn't true. And because for one horrible second, sitting across from the last person who remembered who she used to be, Emily realized that she couldn't fully explain her own life anymore. She couldn't tell Sarah the truth, and the lie wouldn't come. "I'm okay," she finally managed. "It's a lot, but I'm okay." Sarah didn't believe her. Emily could see it. And when they hugged goodbye on the sidewalk, Sarah held on a beat too long, the way you hold on to someone you're afraid you're losing. They never spoke again, not because anything happened, just because Emily let it fade, the way she was letting everything from the old life fade, and she hated herself for it, and she did it anyway. That was the price. Nobody had written it into the 17 pages, but it was the real contract, and she was paying it one severed connection at a time. Then in the 4th month, something happened that changed everything, that took all of Emily's careful ambivalence, all of her, maybe I can still leave, and burned it to the ground. It started with a phone call at 2 a.m. Victor's voice tight in a way she'd never heard. "Get dressed. Anton's coming for you. 10 minutes. "What's happened?" "There's a situation. I need you." A pause. "I need your mind, Ms. Carter, and I need it clear. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said, already reaching for her clothes. The car took her not to the office, but to a warehouse in an industrial stretch of the waterfront, and when she walked in, she found Victor standing over a man tied to a chair. The man's face was bloody. 2 of Victor's associates stood nearby, and the air in the room was thick with something Emily had never smelled before, and she realized with a lurch that it was fear the man in the chair was terrified, and with good reason. Victor turned to her. "This man's name is Petrov. He was moving product for us through the Brighton Beach corridor. 3 days ago, a shipment vanished. $500,000 gone. He says he doesn't know what happened to it. My associates believe he's lying." Victor's eyes were flat cold. "I want you to talk to him." "Talk to him. He speaks Russian, broken English. My men can't get the truth out of him because they can't hear the truth from the lies, but you can." Victor stepped closer to her, his voice low. "I don't want to hurt him more than necessary, Ms. Carter. Believe it or not, I don't. But I need to know what happened to that shipment, because if he stole it, he's not the only one involved, and the others will come for us next. Talk to him. Find out if he's lying. His life may depend on your answer." And there it was. The moment Emily Carter would remember for the rest of her life as the moment she truly crossed over. Because Victor wasn't just asking her to translate. He was asking her to sit in judgment. To use her gift, the gift her grandmother had given her, the gift meant to protect her, to decide whether a man lived or died. She could have refused. She could have turned around and walked out and invoked the 30-day clause and gone back to carrying plates. She didn't. She walked over to the man in the chair. She knelt down so she was at his eye level, and she began to speak to him in Russian softly, gently, the way her grandmother's neighbors had spoken to her when she was a lonely child. And the man Petrov looked at her with wild, desperate eyes, and something in Emily's gentleness broke through his terror, and he began to talk. And Emily listened. She listened not just to his words, but to everything underneath them, the tremor, the pauses, the places where his story got too smooth, and the places where it fell apart. She listened the way she'd listened her whole life, and after 10 minutes she stood up and walked back to Victor and spoke in a voice only he could hear. "He didn't steal it," she said. "He's telling the truth. He doesn't know what happened to the shipment, but he knows who does, and he's more afraid of that person than he is of you, which is why he's been holding back." She paused. "It's a man named Kessler. Petrov saw him at the warehouse the night before the shipment vanished. He didn't say anything because Kessler threatened his family. Petrov has a daughter. She's 6. Victor studied her face. "You're certain?" I'm certain. How certain? Emily held his gaze. Certain enough to stake his life on it, which is what you're really asking, isn't it? Whether I'm willing to put my judgment between this man and the grave. She swallowed. I am. He's not lying. Let him go, Victor, and go find Kessler. It was the first time she'd called him by his first name. Victor looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, and he told his associates to release Petrov to give him money to see that his daughter was protected. And Petrov wept and grabbed Emily's hand and thanked her in Russian again and again, calling her an angel, and Emily stood there and let him, and felt like anything but. Because she understood in that warehouse what she had become. She had just saved a man's life, but she'd done it by proving she was willing to sit in judgment of it. She'd done it by becoming exactly what Victor needed her to be, not an assistant, not a translator, but a weapon of discernment, a woman whose read on a person could decide whether they walked out of a room or didn't. She had wanted to become a lawyer to help people, and she had, in a way. She'd just done it in a warehouse at 3 a.m, standing beside a man who had people killed, and she'd never felt further from the girl her grandmother had raised. In the car home, neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Victor said quietly, You saved his life tonight. You understand that if you'd hesitated, if you'd shown any doubt, my men would have kept going, and he'd be dead by morning. Your certainty saved him. I know. Most people couldn't have done what you did tonight. I know that too. Emily looked out the window at the dark water sliding past. That's what I can't forgive myself for, that I could, that some part of me was calm the whole time, that I knelt down in front of a bleeding man and I wasn't afraid I was working. She turned to him. You've done something to me. In 4 months, you've turned me into someone who can do that, and I don't know if I should thank you or hate you. Victor was quiet. Then he said something she never forgot. I didn't turn you into anything, Miss Carter. I only gave you permission to stop hiding. Everything you did tonight, everything you are that was always in you. Your grandmother taught you to bury it because she was afraid of what the world would do to a woman that strong. I simply dug it up. He looked at her, and his eyes were not cold now. They were something else. The question you should be asking isn't what I've made you. It's why you're so afraid of what you already were. Emily didn't answer. Because she didn't have an answer. Because he was right, and being right was the cruelest thing he could possibly be. That night, she stood in her expensive apartment and looked at herself in the mirror, and for the first time she didn't see the waitress, and she didn't see the law student, and she didn't see the frightened girl on the floor with a final notice in her hands. She saw someone new, someone sharp and dangerous and capable of terrible things, someone who belonged now to a world she'd sworn she'd only ever observe. And the most frightening part, the part she would never say out loud, not to Sarah, not to Victor, not even fully to herself, was that when she looked at that new woman in the mirror, underneath all the guilt and all the fear, there was something else. There was power, and it felt like coming home. She thought about her grandmother's voice growing fainter every day. Keep your mind quiet. Your mind is your treasure. And she understood at last that Rosa had been protecting her from exactly this, not from the thieves, but from herself, from the discovery of how much she was capable of, from the intoxication of finally being as large as she truly was. Too late now. The door had opened. It only opened one way. And somewhere out in the city, a man named Kessler was about to learn what happened to people who threatened Victor DeLuca's operation, and Emily Carter, who 4 months ago had never so much as raised her voice, was going to be in the room when he did. She could feel it coming, the way she could feel everything now, reading the architecture of her own life, seeing where the weight was gathering, seeing exactly where it was all about to break. She poured herself a glass of wine she couldn't have afforded a year ago, and she sat by the window 40 floors above the city she'd once served, and she waited for whatever came next. She was done pretending she wanted out. That was the truth she finally admitted to herself that night, the truth that severed the last thread connecting her to the person she'd been. She didn't want out. She wanted in. Kessler was found within a week, and Emily learned an uncomfortable truth about herself in the days that followed. She wanted to know how it ended, and she didn't want to ask. Victor never told her the details. She never asked. That was the arrangement they'd fallen into without ever discussing it. There were things she saw and things she was spared, and the space between them was where she kept whatever was left of the girl she used to be. Kessler had threatened a 6-year-old to cover his own theft, Emily told herself that whatever happened to him, he had earned it. And she almost believed it. That was the thing that kept her awake now, not the horror, but how easily she made her peace with it. The daughter Petrov's daughter was safe. Emily made sure of it herself. She found the family a new apartment, arranged for the girl to start at a good school, handled every detail personally. Victor watched her do it and said nothing, but she caught the look on his face, the flicker of something that might have been approval or might have been something warmer. "You didn't have to do that," he told her one evening. "The girl, the apartment, my obligation ended when Petrov walked out of that warehouse alive." "Your obligation, maybe," Emily said. "Not mine." She looked at him steadily. "I'm the reason he's alive. That makes her mine in a way. I put my judgment between that man and a bullet. I don't get to walk away and pretend the rest isn't my responsibility too." Victor studied her for a long moment. "You're going to be a problem," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" "It means you have a conscience and you refuse to let it die. And in my world, that's the most dangerous thing a person can carry." He turned away. "It also means I trust you more than anyone I've ever known, which is its own kind of problem." Emily didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence between them grew warm and complicated, and she went home that night and lay awake trying to name what was happening between her and Victor DeLuca, and failing because there was no name for it. It wasn't love. It was something more dangerous than love. It was recognition. Two people who had spent their whole lives being underestimated, finally seeing each other clearly. The months passed. Emily's second year of law school ended, and she made law review honestly on her own merit. And she stood in the ceremony in a room full of classmates who had no idea what her nights looked like. She smiled and shook hands and accepted congratulations, and she thought about how she was living two lives now and how the seam between them was getting thinner every day. And then the seam tore open completely on a cold night in Little Italy, in a private dining room above a restaurant Victor owned, at a dinner that was supposed to end a war. Emily had spent 3 weeks preparing for it. There was a rival organization, a Georgian outfit that had been moving into territory Victor considered his, and the tension between them had been escalating for months, and everyone knew it was heading toward blood. Victor had decided to try something else first. A meeting. A negotiation. A chance to divide the territory peacefully before it divided them all into graves. He needed Emily for it because the Georgians spoke a mix of Russian and their own language, and because Emily had a gift for finding the deal beneath the deal, and because though he didn't say this part, he trusted her to keep him calm when his own temper wanted war. "This is the most dangerous room I've ever put you in," Victor told her in the car on the way there. "These are not businessmen. These are killers who wear suits. If this goes badly, it will go badly very fast." He looked at her. "You can still say no. I'll take you home right now, no questions." "I'm not going home," Emily said. "You need me in that room." "I do, which is exactly why I'm giving you the chance to refuse. Because I shouldn't need you there. Because you're worth more to me than any territory." He looked away, and Emily felt the weight of what he hadn't quite said settle over both of them. "Just stay behind me if anything happens. Whatever happens. Do you understand?" "Nothing's going to happen. That's the whole point of talking instead of shooting." But Victor didn't answer, and his jaw was tight, and Emily understood that he knew something she didn't felt, something she couldn't. And for the first time in months, she was afraid. The dinner began well. That was the cruel part. The Georgians arrived, 6 of them, led by a broad, silver-haired man named Dato, who had the eyes of someone who had killed with his own hands and slept fine afterward. There was wine. There was food. There was the elaborate courtesy of dangerous men, pretending for the length of a meal to be civilized. Emily sat at Victor's right hand and translated, and she was flawless, catching every nuance, smoothing every rough edge, finding the language that let both men save face. For an hour, it worked. For an hour, Emily Carter believed she was watching 2 empires step back from the edge because of the words coming out of her mouth. She felt something she'd never felt before, that her gift, the thing her grandmother had told her to hide, was holding back a war. That she was in that room, the most important person at the table, not Victor, her, because without her they couldn't even understand each other. And then at 9:40 at night, everything went to hell. It started with a sound. A crash from downstairs in the main restaurant muffled, but wrong. Dotto's head came up. Victor's hand moved toward his jacket. And then the door to the private room exploded inward, and men poured through it with guns already raised, and someone was shouting in a language that wasn't Italian or Russian or Georgian, and the first gunshot cracked through the room like the end of the world. It wasn't the Georgians. That was the thing nobody understood in the first terrible seconds. It wasn't Dotto's men, and it wasn't Victor's men. It was a third party, a hit and ambush, someone who had known both crews would be in this room tonight unarmed by agreement guards left downstairs and had decided to end two wars by starting a third. The room erupted into chaos. Dotto went down or dove down. Emily couldn't tell which. Glass shattered. A man screamed. Victor grabbed Emily and threw her behind the overturned table, his body between her and the door, and she heard him fire back once, twice, and she heard bodies hitting the floor, and she couldn't tell whose. "Stay down," Victor snarled. "Stay down, don't move, don't..." And then he grunted a sound that wasn't words, and Emily felt him stagger against her. And when she looked, there was blood on his side, spreading dark and fast, and Victor DeLuca, who had never once in her presence looked anything but invincible, had been shot. "Victor, I'm fine. Stay down." But his voice was wrong thin, and his hand where it gripped her shoulder was trembling, and Emily understood that he was not fine, that he was bleeding, that the man who had reached into her life and remade it was going to die on this floor if something didn't change in the next 60 seconds. The shooting had paused. In the ringing silence, Emily heard footsteps, someone moving through the room, methodical, finishing what they'd started. She peered around the edge of the table and saw them three attackers still standing, one of them walking toward where Dotto lay, one covering the room, and one moving directly toward her, and Victor, gun raised close, now close enough that she could see his face. And Emily's whole body went cold because she knew him. She knew that face. It was older, harder scarred in a way it hadn't been when she was a child, but it was him, Dmitri. Dmitri Volkov, who had lived 3 doors down from her grandmother's apartment in Queens, who had taught her Russian card games on a stoop in the summer, who had been 15 when she was 9, and had once chased off a group of older boys who'd been tormenting her. Dmitri, who had disappeared from the neighborhood one winter and never come back, and whom she'd assumed in the vague way you assume things about people from your childhood, had simply grown up and moved on. He hadn't moved on. He'd become this, and he was pointing a gun at her. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? The last time he'd seen her, she'd been a scrawny 9-year-old with braids. Now she was a woman in an expensive suit crouched behind a table beside a bleeding crime boss. He saw a target. He saw a witness. He raised the gun to finish the job. And Emily did the only thing she had left. She did the thing her grandmother had spent a lifetime teaching her, the thing that had started this whole descent in a restaurant a year ago. She used her voice, but not in Italian this time, in Russian. In the specific particular Russian of their old neighborhood, the slang, the rhythm, the exact way the people from that block on that street had spoken. "Dmitri," she said, and her voice cut through the chaos, steady, impossible. "Dmitri Volkov, it's Emily, Rosa's Emily from Sunnyside. You taught me Durak on the steps. You chased off the Kowalski boys when they took my shoes." The gun didn't lower, but it didn't fire either. Dmitri's face, which had been a mask, cracked. He stared at her. His eyes moved over her face, searching, disbelieving, and Emily watched the years peel back in his expression, watched him find the 9-year-old inside the woman. "Emmy," he said, in Russian, his voice breaking on the word. It's me, Dmitri. Please, please don't do this. Please. Behind her, Victor was struggling to raise his own gun, and Emily reached back without looking and gripped his wrist hard, stopping him. Because she understood in that impossible frozen second that the only thing keeping them alive was the confusion on Dmitri's face, and a gunshot would end it. "Put it down," she said, still in Russian, still in that old neighborhood cadence. "You don't want to kill me. You never wanted to hurt anyone from home. I know you, Dmitri. I know who you were before all this. That boy is still in there. I'm looking at him right now." "You don't know what I am now," Dmitri said, and his voice was anguished, and the gun trembled. "I know exactly what you are now," Emily said. "You're a man doing a terrible job for people who don't care if you live or die. Just like the man behind me. Just like everyone in this room." She held his eyes. But underneath that, you're the boy who gave a scared little girl her shoes back. And that boy is not going to shoot Rosa Carter's granddaughter on the floor of a restaurant. He's not. I won't believe it." The room had gone silent around them. The other two attackers had stopped uncertain, watching their leader hold a conversation in Russian with a target who was supposed to be dead already. And Emily realized with a jolt of terrible clarity that she had a sliver of control here, a fraction of a second of leverage, and if she was going to use it, she had to use it now before it collapsed. She rose slowly to her feet. Victor hissed at her to stay down, but she ignored him. She stood unarmed blood on her expensive suit that wasn't hers, and she faced a room full of armed men, and she did the most dangerous thing she had ever done. She started to negotiate. "Listen to me," she said, switching, now raising her voice so the whole room could hear, speaking Russian for the attackers, and then repeating herself in Italian for Victor's men, and in the Georgians' tongue for Dato's people, her mind moving faster than it ever had, translating not just words, but intentions, becoming the only bridge in a room full of people who wanted to kill each other and couldn't even communicate. "Everyone in this room is about to die for nothing. Whoever sent you," she looked at Dmitri, "whoever sent you wanted DeLuca and the Georgians to destroy each other. They wanted you to walk in here and light the match. But if you finish this, you don't walk away clean. You walk away hunted, by his people, by theirs, by everyone who ever did business with either of these men. You'll have started a war that ends with your body in a river. And if we stop," Dmitri said, "if you stop, you walk out of here with your life, and I personally make sure that no one in this room comes after you tonight." She turned to Victor, still on the floor, bleeding, his face gray. "Victor, tell them. Tell them if they lower their weapons and walk out, they leave alive. Give me your word. Give it to me right now." Victor looked up at her, and in his eyes was something she had never seen, not calculation, not control, but a raw, unguarded astonishment. He was watching a woman he'd plucked from a restaurant hold a room full of killers at bay with nothing but her voice. He was watching her do the thing he'd seen in her that first night, the thing he'd been waiting a year to witness. The ocean finally was done pretending to be a puddle. "You have my word," Victor said, loud enough for the room, and Emily translated it, and then she turned to Dato, who was alive after all, wounded and propped against the wall, and she spoke to him too. "And you," she said, "your war with DeLuca ends tonight one way or another. Either you both die here, or you both walk out and split the territory the way we spent 3 weeks arranging. Those are the only two options left in this room. Choose." The seconds stretched into eternity. Emily stood in the center of it, unarmed, trembling, now that the words were done, waiting to find out if she'd just saved everyone or gotten them all killed. Dimitri's gun was still raised. Dato's men had their hands near their own hidden weapons. Victor was bleeding out on the floor, and the whole thing balanced on a knife's edge on the memory of a boy who'd given a little girl her shoes back 20 years ago. Then Dmitri lowered his gun. He lowered it slowly, and he looked at Emily with an expression that was half grief and half wonder. And he said in that old neighborhood Russian, "Rosa would be proud of you and ashamed of the company you keep." "I know," Emily whispered. "Believe me, I know." Dmitri gestured to his men. They backed toward the door, weapons still up but no longer aimed to kill, and Emily kept talking the entire time, kept the room stable with the sheer force of her voice, translating, reassuring, holding 3 armed factions in a fragile equilibrium by pure will. And then, at the door, Dmitri paused and looked back at her one last time. "They'll ask me why I didn't finish it," he said. "The people who sent me. What do I tell them?" "Tell them the target was already dead when you got there," Emily said. "Tell them someone beat you to it, and then disappear Dmitri. For real this time. Go somewhere they can't find you and be the person Rosa's neighborhood raised, not the one that took you. You still can. You're proof standing right there that it's still possible." Dmitri held her gaze for a long moment, and then he was gone, and his men with him, and the door swung shut, and the room let out a collective breath that sounded like 100 people surfacing from underwater. And then Emily was on her knees beside Victor, pressing her hands against the wound in his side, shouting for someone to call a doctor, the real Emily flooding back into her body all at once. The fear, the shaking, the horror of what had almost happened. Victor caught her wrist with a bloody hand. "Emily," he breathed, "don't talk. Save your strength. Help is coming. Emily, look at me." His grip tightened. "What you just did. Do you understand what you just did? I kept us alive." "No." His voice was fading, but his eyes were burning. "You commanded a room full of men who kill for a living, in 3 languages, with nothing. No weapon, no leverage, no power, except the one thing no one can take from you." He almost smiled, even as the blood spread beneath her hands. "You stopped being outside this world tonight, Ms. Carter. You just became the most dangerous person in it, and you did it to save my life." "Stop talking." "I mean it. That boy Dimitri, he was your childhood. Your old life walked through that door with a gun, and you didn't run from it. You used it. You turned the last thread of who you used to be into the thing that saved us all." His eyes searched her face. "There's no going back from that. You know that. You felt it happen. The girl from the restaurant is gone, truly gone now. Do you understand?" And Emily, kneeling in blood, her hands pressed against the life of a man she couldn't decide whether to love or fear, understood that he was right. She'd felt it happen in real time. The moment she rose to her feet in that room, the moment she chose to use Dimitri instead of running from him, some final door had closed behind her, quietly, permanently. She had reached back into her innocence and used it as a weapon, and you couldn't do that and remain innocent. It didn't work that way. The doctor came. Victor lived. The wound was bad but not fatal, and the private surgeon Victor kept on retainer patched him together in a safe house before dawn. Emily didn't leave his side. She sat in a hard chair through the whole thing, still in her ruined suit, and she watched the man breathe, and she tried to understand what she was feeling, and she couldn't. Around 4 a.m, Victor woke pale and weak and found her sitting there. "You stayed," he said. "Where else would I go?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The people who did this, the ambush, I need to know who sent them. Dimitri could have told us, but you sent him away." "I sent him away because it was the only way to end it without more blood," Emily said. "And because he saved my life once when I was 9, and I wasn't going to hand him over to die. I'd do it again." She leaned forward. "But you don't need Dimitri to know who sent them, Victor. You already know. So do I." Victor's eyes sharpened. "Say it." Someone knew both crews would be in that room. Someone knew the terms, "no guards upstairs, weapons left below, both sides vulnerable at the same moment." That information came from inside. Inside your organization or inside Dato's. Emily's voice was flat, certain the voice she used when she'd read the architecture of a thing and found where it broke. Somebody at that table tonight or close to it sold both of you to a third party. This wasn't a rival move. This was a betrayal from someone you trust. The room was silent. Victor stared at her, and slowly, painfully, he began to understand that she was right, that the ambush had been an inside job, that someone in his own house had opened the door to the men with guns. "Who?" Victor said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand aimed at the universe. "I don't know yet," Emily said, "but I'm going to find out. Because whoever it is tried to kill you tonight, and they used a war I was trying to prevent to do it, and they nearly put a bullet in me in the process." Something had hardened in her voice, something cold and new and frightening even to herself. "I stopped a massacre tonight with nothing but my voice, Victor. Finding one traitor in your organization is going to feel like a vacation." Victor looked at her for a long moment. This woman he'd made this weapon he'd forged, without fully understanding what he was forging. And when he spoke, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, not the confidence of a man who owned everything, but the careful respect of a man who has realized he is no longer the most formidable person in the room. "You've changed," he said quietly. "You changed me." "No." He shook his head weakly against the pillow. "I keep telling you, I only opened the door. What walked through it?" He almost laughed and winced at the pain of it. What walked through it, God help me, I'm not sure even I can control anymore. And Emily Carter, sitting in the gray light before dawn, with a dangerous man's blood dried on her hands and a traitor to hunt, and the last piece of her old self spent as ammunition on a restaurant floor, realized that he was afraid of her. Just a little. For the first time. and she realized with a quiet horror that she was already learning to live with that she didn't mind. She stood up, she went to the window, and she looked out at the waking city, the city she'd once served on aching feet, the city that had almost swallowed her, and instead had made her into this, and she began coldly, methodically to think about who in Victor DeLuca's world had wanted him dead, and how she was going to find them, and what she was going to do when she did. The waitress was gone. She'd known it for months, but now she felt it settle into her bones as fact. In her place stood someone who could hold a war in the palm of her hand and close her fingers around it. Someone her grandmother had spent a lifetime trying to keep buried. Someone who was at last exactly as large as she had always been. Finding the traitor took Emily 11 days, and the answer when she found it nearly broke her. She approached it the way she'd approached everything since the restaurant, the way her grandmother had taught her, by listening to what people were pretending not to feel. Victor recovered slowly in the safe house, too weak to move through his own organization, and so it fell to Emily to move through it for him. And she discovered in those 11 days that being underestimated was the sharpest weapon she'd ever held. To Victor's men, she was still the assistant, the law student, the woman the boss had a soft spot for. They talked in front of her. They relaxed around her. And she watched all of them, everyone reading the architecture, looking for the place where the weight was wrong. She started with what she knew. The ambush had required inside information, the terms of the meeting, the timing, the vulnerability. Only a handful of people had known all of it. Victor's second-in-command, a heavy, quiet man named Sal, who'd been with Victor for 20 years. Victor's accountant, Feldman, who knew where every dollar moved. His head of security, a former soldier named Ray, and 2 or 3 others in the inner circle who had been close enough to piece it together. She ruled out Sal within 3 days. Not because he was above suspicion, but because when she mentioned the ambush to him watching his face, she saw grief. Real grief. The grief of a man who had failed to protect someone he loved. Sal blamed himself for not being in that room, and the self-hatred in him was too genuine to fake. Emily crossed him off. Feldman she watched longer. Money was always a motive, and accountants always knew where the bodies were buried. But Feldman was terrified of everything, of everyone, a nervous man who flinched at loud noises. He didn't have the nerve to betray Victor. Betrayal took a certain kind of cold courage, and Feldman didn't have it. She crossed him off too, though more slowly, which left Ray, the head of security, the former soldier, the man responsible for the fact that there had been no guards upstairs that night. And here, Emily made her first mistake. Because Ray was the obvious answer, and she wanted it to be Ray, because Ray was a hard man she'd never liked, and it would have been clean and satisfying for the traitor to be someone she could hate without complication. She spent 4 days building the case against Ray, and it fit, and she brought it to Victor almost eager, and Victor listened to all of it, and then said something that stopped her cold. "You want it to be Ray," he said. "I can hear it in your voice. You've decided, and now you're finding reasons." Emily opened her mouth to argue, and then she closed it. Because he was right. She'd violated the first rule her grandmother ever taught her. She'd let what she wanted to be true shape what she believed was true. She'd stopped listening and started deciding. "Start over," Victor said. "Forget what you want. Just listen. Who benefits, not who you'd like it to be, who actually benefits if I die?" And Emily went back to the beginning, and this time she listened without wanting anything, and the answer that emerged was one she had refused to consider because it was the one that hurt. It was Sal. Not because Sal wanted Victor dead, but because Sal was dying. Emily discovered it almost by accident on the 10th day in a pharmacy receipt she found in the trash of Sal's office, a medication she recognized because her grandmother had taken it at the end. Pancreatic. The kind that gave you months, not years. And once she saw it, everything reorganized itself in her mind, all the pieces snapping into a new and terrible shape. Sal's grief hadn't been about failing to protect Victor. It had been the grief of a man who knew he was already gone. Sal, who had been loyal for 20 years, who had nothing left to protect and no future to lose, who had a daughter of his own. With debts, Emily now traced through the accounts a daughter whose life could be secured forever by one final betrayal, by selling the terms of a meeting to men who'd pay a fortune to end Victor DeLuca. Sal wasn't betraying Victor out of hatred. He was betraying him out of love for a child he'd leave behind and wanted to leave rich. Emily sat with this for a full day before she told Victor, because she understood it. God help her, she understood it completely. A dying man trying to provide for his daughter the only way he had left. It was the same math Victor had used to justify killing Ricci Mercy to one is a death sentence to another. It was the same math she'd made her peace with in a warehouse at 3 a.m. And now it had turned around and pointed itself at the man who'd taught it to her. When she finally told Victor, he didn't rage. That was the worst part. He went very still and very quiet, and something in his face aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain. I traced the payment. It routed through 3 shells, but it landed in an account tied to Sal's daughter. $2 million 4 days after the ambush." Emily's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "He sold you to secure her future, because he's dying, Victor. He has maybe 3 months. He didn't think he'd be alive to face what he'd done." Victor was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. 20 years. He was there when I buried my wife. He held me up at the funeral. I've trusted him with my life 100 times. He looked at Emily. "And you're telling me he opened the door for the men who tried to take it?" "I'm telling you what I found, what you do with it." Emily stopped, because she knew what he did with it. She knew exactly what happened to people who betrayed Victor DeLuca. And she understood with a sick lurch that she had just signed a dying man's death warrant, that her gift, her precious gift, had once again been used to decide whether a person lived or died. Only this time it wasn't a stranger in a warehouse. It was a man she'd worked beside for a year. A man whose only crime was loving his daughter too much to leave her poor. "Victor," she said, "wait, before you do anything, just wait." "Why?" "Because he's already dying. Killing him accomplishes nothing except your own satisfaction. His daughter still has the money. The men who paid him still have their war. All you get is the corpse of a man who was loyal to you for 2 decades, killed in his last months of life." She stepped closer. "You told me once that right and necessary are almost never the same thing, that the first lesson of this world was learning to tell them apart. So tell me, is killing Sal right, or is it just necessary? And if it's neither, if it's just revenge, then what does that make you?" Victor stared at her, and Emily watched him wrestle with it, watched the man of pure calculation collide with the man who had just learned his oldest friend had betrayed him, and she didn't know which one would win. "What would you have me do?" he said at last, and there was something almost pleading in it, something she'd never heard from him. "Let him die on his own timeline," Emily said. 3 months. Let his daughter keep the money you can afford it, and taking it back only orphans a girl who did nothing wrong. But cut him out. He never sits at your table again, never knows your business again, never gets the chance to do it twice. And before he dies, you look him in the eye, and you let him know that you know. That's the punishment, Victor. Not a bullet. The knowledge that he spent his last loyalty betraying the one person who trusted him most, and that person found out and let him live anyway. That'll hurt him more than any death. Mercy from the man he wronged. It'll haunt him into the grave. The room was silent. Victor looked at her, and slowly something shifted in his expression, a kind of dawning, a kind of awe. "You've become more ruthless than I am," he said quietly. "You just designed a punishment crueler than murder, and called it mercy." "I learned from the best," Emily said, and she didn't smile when she said it because it wasn't a compliment, and they both knew it. Victor did as she suggested. He confronted Sal alone. Emily wasn't in the room, but she saw Sal leave afterward, and the man who walked out was already a ghost, hollowed out, carrying a weight that would follow him to his grave. Sal died 2 months later in a hospital bed, and Victor did not visit, and the daughter kept her money and never knew what her father had done to earn it, and that Emily thought was its own kind of mercy too. But something had changed in Emily in the finding of it. She had crossed another line, not the line of watching violence or standing beside it, but the line of designing it. She had architected a man's suffering. She had used her mind, her grandmother's treasure, to engineer a punishment, and she had been good at it, frighteningly good. That night she and Victor sat together in his study, both of them raw in ways they didn't have words for, and something between them finally broke open. I don't know what I'm becoming, Emily admitted. A year ago, I served risotto to strangers and worried about my rent. Tonight, I designed a dying man's punishment, and I was proud of how clever it was. Proud Victor. What kind of person is proud of that? A person who's stopped lying to herself, Victor said, which is rarer and harder than staying innocent. Is that supposed to comfort me? No, it's supposed to be true. He looked at her across the space between them, and his face was open in a way it almost never was. You want to know what I see when I look at you now? I see the only person in my entire life who has ever fully understood me, not feared me, not obeyed me, understood me. You know what I do and why I do it. You've done it yourself. You've stood where I stand, and you've made the choices I make, and you haven't run, and you haven't broken, and you haven't turned into a monster either. You've become something I didn't think existed. His voice dropped. Someone who can live in this world with their eyes fully open and their soul still intact. I didn't believe that was possible. I stopped believing it a long time ago, and then I heard a waitress speak Italian, and everything I thought I knew turned out to be wrong. Emily's breath caught, because she understood what he was saying underneath the words. She'd been reading the architecture of him for a year, and she read it now clearly, and what she saw made her heart pound. "Victor," she said carefully, "what is this between us? What are we doing?" "I don't know," he said. "I've never done it before, whatever this is." He almost laughed. "I've had partners, associates, women who wanted my money, and men who wanted my protection. I've never had an equal. Someone I couldn't buy or frighten or control. Someone I need." He looked at her. "I need you, Emily. Not the way I've needed anyone, not for what you can do for me, for who you are. And that terrifies me because everything I've ever needed the world has found a way to take." And there it was, the wall she'd never been able to see behind. His wife, the death he never spoke of. Emily understood finally that Victor DeLuca had loved once and lost that love to this world, and had spent 30 years making sure he'd never be vulnerable again. And now, against all his own defenses, he was vulnerable again. To her. "What happened to her?" Emily asked softly. "Your wife." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he did. "They killed her to get to me," he said. "Early on, when I was building all this, a rival wanted to send a message, and she was the message. I came home and—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I built everything after that out of one promise, that no one would ever be able to hurt me that way again, that I'd never love anything the world could take from me." He looked at Emily, and his eyes were wet, and she had never seen that, not once. "And now here you are, the one thing I swore I'd never let happen, standing in my study, having just outmaneuvered me, knowing everything about me, and I can't make myself push you away. I've tried. I can't do it." Emily crossed the room. She didn't decide to. Her body simply moved, and she stood in front of him, this dangerous man, this man who had reached into her life and remade it. This man she should have run from 100 times and hadn't, and she understood that she'd stopped being able to imagine a life without him somewhere along the way, and she didn't know when it had happened, and it didn't matter anymore. "Then don't push me away," she said. "You know what loving me makes you," Victor said. A target, the way she was. Everything that came for her will come for you. That's the truth. I won't lie to you. I told you I never would. Loving me could get you killed. "I stopped a war with my voice 10 days ago," Emily said. "I found a traitor you couldn't find. I designed a punishment that haunted a man to his grave. I'm not your wife, Victor. I'm not a message someone can send. Anyone who comes for me is going to find out what I found out in that restaurant, that I'm a great deal more dangerous than I look." She reached up and put her hand against his face. "I'm not afraid of your world anymore. I'm part of it now. I'm not the thing you love that the world can take. I'm the thing that makes you harder to take from." And Victor DeLuca, who had spent 30 years being afraid of exactly this, pulled her against him and held on like a man, holding on to the one thing that had ever mattered. And Emily held him back, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else to say. That was the night everything between them changed, not into something soft, nothing about their world allowed for soft, but into something real. A partnership sealed not just in business, but in the deeper thing underneath it, the recognition that had been there since the first night, since across a crowded restaurant, a powerful man had watched a waitress reveal herself by accident and thought, "I want her," and hadn't yet understood that what he wanted would one day become his equal, his partner, and in some ways, his master. The months that followed were the strangest kind of happiness Emily had ever known. She finished her final year of law school, and she passed the bar, and she stood in a courtroom and was sworn in as an attorney, and her grandmother's ghost stood beside her silent and unreadable. She was a lawyer now, officially. The dream Rosa had sacrificed everything for, and she used it just as Victor had promised the first night, not to defend the innocent in courtrooms, but as a weapon of influence in rooms where the real decisions were made. She became indispensable in a way that went beyond translation now. She structured Victor's operations to move legitimate and illegitimate money through channels the law couldn't touch. She sat across from prosecutors and judges and read them like books, knowing which ones could be reasoned with and which ones had to be routed around. She negotiated with rival organizations and diplomats and men whose names never appeared in any newspaper, and she did it all in whatever language the moment required, and she was so good at it that Victor's organization grew more powerful and more stable and more untouchable than it had ever been. And the violence she'd once watched in horror began slowly to recede. Because Emily was better than violence. She could achieve with a conversation what Victor's men had once achieved with guns. She could find the deal that let everyone walk away, could locate the pressure point that made war unnecessary, could turn enemies into partners, with nothing but her understanding of what they were pretending not to feel. Under her influence, Victor DeLuca's empire became something it had never been before: peaceful. Not good, never good, but peaceful, efficient, stable. "You've done something I couldn't do in 30 years, Victor told her once. "You've made all of this run without blood. Do you understand how impossible that is? Men have tried. They always fail because the only language this world respects is force. And then you walked in and proved there was a stronger language after all." "There always was," Emily said. "You just couldn't speak it. My grandmother could. She used to end fights in our whole building with a look and 3 sentences. I thought it was nothing when I was a child. Now I understand it was the most powerful thing I ever saw." Emily and Victor were married in a small ceremony that winter attended by no one who mattered to the outside world and everyone who mattered to theirs. She wore her grandmother's ring. She kept her own name professionally but privately in the world they'd built. She became Emily DeLuca, and the name felt less like a loss of self than a completion of it. She had come into this world as a waitress, observing from the outside, holding a tray, and now she stood at its very center, married to its most powerful figure, and more powerful in the ways that counted than he was. She should have felt trapped. Some nights she waited to feel trapped the way she'd once waited to feel horror. It didn't come. What came instead was something she'd never expected, something that would have been unrecognizable to the frightened girl on the floor of a tiny apartment with a final notice in her hands. What came was peace and purpose and a strange, hard-won understanding of exactly who she was. She thought about her grandmother's rule, the rule that had governed her whole life. Keep your mind quiet. Your mind is your treasure. You do not show your treasure to thieves. And she understood now that Rosa had been half right and half wrong. She'd been right that the mind was a treasure, but she'd been wrong about the thieves, because the world didn't take your treasure when you revealed it. The world bent around it. The trick wasn't hiding your gift. The trick was becoming powerful enough that no one could take it from you when you finally set it free. Emily had done that. She'd become that powerful. And in doing so, she'd become the one thing her grandmother had spent a lifetime trying to prevent, and also the one thing her grandmother would have been most proud of. And the fact that both could be true at once was the truth she carried now, the truth that had replaced all her old certainties. She'd wanted to be a lawyer to help people, and she did help people in her way. She helped Petrov's daughter, who was thriving now in a good school, safe. She helped the men whose families would have been destroyed if certain wars had been allowed to happen. She helped Victor become something less brutal than he'd been. She helped constantly in 1,000 small ways the law would never recognize and could never permit. She'd just done it from inside a world the law was built to destroy. And she'd made her peace with the contradiction, because she'd learned the deepest lesson of Victor's world at last, that the choice was almost never between good and evil. It was between one kind of harm and another, and the only mercy available was the mercy of choosing well, of being wise enough and strong enough to choose the lesser wound. She was wise enough now, and strong enough. She'd built herself into someone who could stand in the darkest rooms in the city and choose the lesser wound again and again and live with it. Late one night near the end of that winter, Emily stood at the window of the home she shared with Victor, high above the city, and she thought about the waitress she'd been. The girl who'd carried 4 plates on one arm and a secret in her chest. The girl who'd been drowning politely for years. She felt no grief for that girl anymore. Only a distant tenderness, the way you feel toward a younger sibling who didn't yet understand what they were capable of. Victor came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I don't recognize my own life," Emily said, "and that I've never been more myself." She leaned against him. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night in your office? You said you wanted to see what I'd become when I finally stopped hiding." "I remember. Are you satisfied with what I became?" Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm afraid of what you became, and I've never respected anyone more. And I love you more than I've allowed myself to love anything since I was a young man." He looked out at the city. "So yes, I'm satisfied, and I'm terrified, and I wouldn't change a single choice that led here." Emily smiled, and it was a real smile, and she looked out at the city that had almost swallowed her, and instead had crowned her. And for the first time in her life, she felt the thing her grandmother had never lived to feel. She felt unafraid. And she had no idea, standing there in the warmth of that hard-won peace, that her life was about to change one final time. That a doctor's appointment 3 days away would deliver news that would transform everything all over again. That the woman who had become a legal architect and a broker of wars and the equal of the most powerful man in the underground was about to face the one role she had no training for, no language, for no way to negotiate or read or control. She had no idea yet that she was going to become a mother, but that revelation and everything it would mean was still 3 days away. For now, there was only the city below and the man beside her, and the quiet, astonishing peace of a woman who had finally completely stopped pretending to be anything other than exactly as large as she was. The news came on a Tuesday in a doctor's office, and Emily DeLuca, who had faced down a room full of armed killers without flinching, sat frozen in a chair and could not make herself breathe. "You're certain," she said. And it was the same question she'd asked Victor 100 times the question of a woman who trusted nothing she couldn't verify. "About 8 weeks along," the doctor said gently. "Congratulations, Mrs. DeLuca." Emily walked out into the winter afternoon, and she didn't call Anton, and she didn't call the car. She walked. For blocks and blocks, she walked through the cold city, the way she'd walked 40 blocks on the night this all began, when Victor had first offered her a life, and she'd tried to refuse it. And she understood that she was afraid in a way she hadn't been afraid in years. Not for herself. She'd stopped being afraid for herself somewhere in that Little Italy restaurant. This was different. This was the oldest fear there was, and no gift, no language, no ruthless, clever mind could negotiate with it. Because she remembered what Victor had told her about his wife. They killed her to get to me, and now Emily was going to bring a child into that world, a child who would be from its first breath exactly what Victor's wife had been, a message someone could send, a target, a vulnerability walking around on 2 small legs. She stood on a street corner as the light failed, and she pressed her hand to her stomach, and for the first time since she'd risen to her feet in a room full of guns, Emily Carter did not know what to do. She told Victor that night. She'd rehearsed a dozen ways to say it, and in the end, she said none of them. She simply took his hand and put it where the doctor had put the cold instrument that afternoon, and she looked at him and Victor DeLuca, who had buried friends and enemies, and a wife who had ordered deaths without blinking, who had built an empire on the promise that he'd never love anything the world could take, understood, and his face did something Emily had never seen it do. It crumbled. Not with grief, with terror and joy so tangled together they couldn't be pulled apart. He sat down heavily as if his legs had stopped working, and he stared at his own hand against her body, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely there. "No," he said. "No, Emily. We can't." "Victor, you know what happened. You know what this world does to the things I love. I told you. I told you." He stood up and he was shaking, and Emily realized she was watching a powerful man come apart at the seams. "I lost her because someone wanted to hurt me, and I swore on her grave that I would never put anyone in that position again. And now you're telling me there's a child who'll be born a target, who'll spend its whole life with a knife at its throat because of who its father is." His voice broke. "I can't do it. I can't watch it happen again. I can't bury another person I love because I was too selfish to stay alone." And Emily, who had talked down killers and outmaneuvered dying traitors and become the most dangerous voice in the city, faced the hardest negotiation of her life. Not with an enemy, with the fear of the man she loved. And she understood that she couldn't out-argue this fear because it wasn't irrational. It was the most rational fear he had. He was right. The child would be a target. Everything he was saying was true. So she didn't argue. She did something harder. She told the truth. "You're right," she said, "about all of it. A child of ours will be born into danger. That's real, and I won't pretend it isn't." She took his face in her hands the way her grandmother used to take hers. "But listen to me, Victor. Listen. When they killed your wife, who was she? A woman who couldn't defend herself. A woman who didn't know your world. A woman they could reach because there was no one standing between her and the dark." Her voice hardened, filled with the cold certainty that had frightened even her. "That's not who this child's mother is. I stopped a war with my voice. I found the traitor you couldn't find. I've made your entire empire run without blood for a year. Anyone who comes for our child is going to have to come through me first. And I am not the woman they killed to send you a message. I am the woman who sends the message back." Victor stared at her. "You want to protect this child?" Emily went on. "Then we don't protect it by refusing to let it exist. We protect it the way I've protected everything since I walked into your world, by being smarter and more dangerous and more prepared than everyone who'd wish it harm. This child won't be a vulnerability, Victor. It'll be the reason you and I become untouchable, because I have spent a year learning to make this world bend, and I promise you, I will bend the whole world into a fortress around our child before I let a single hand reach it." For a long moment, Victor didn't move, and then he pulled her against him, and he buried his face in her hair, and Emily felt him shake with something that was half sob and half laugh, the sound of a man setting down a weight he'd carried for 30 years. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "How do you take my worst fear and turn it into a weapon? Every time. How?" "My grandmother taught me," Emily said. "You take the thing they're pretending not to feel and you hold it up to the light and you show them it's not what they thought it was." She pulled back and looked at him. "You're not afraid of the child, Victor. You're afraid of loving something again. And I'm telling you, it's already too late. You already love it. I can see it in your face. So the only question left is whether we're brave enough to love it out loud." Victor wiped his eyes, this man who never wept, and he laughed, wet and broken and real. "I've never been brave," he said. "I've been ruthless. There's a difference. I learned that the day I met you." The pregnancy changed everything just as Emily had known it would, but not in the way Victor had feared. It changed the way they moved through their world. "Yes." Emily stepped back from the most dangerous negotiations, and Victor tightened their security into something no army could breach. But it changed something deeper, too. It changed the reason for all of it. Because for the first time, they weren't building power for its own sake, or for survival, or out of Victor's ancient refusal to ever be helpless again. They were building it for someone. Every deal Emily structured, every war she prevented, every fortune she moved through, channels the law couldn't follow, all of it now had a purpose it had never had before. A small, growing, impossible purpose that neither of them had planned and both of them would have died for. And Emily discovered over those months that Victor was changing. The man who had once ordered deaths without blinking began quietly to pull back from the parts of the business that had blood on them. Not because Emily asked, because something in the prospect of his child had reached into him and rearranged him the way he'd once reached into Emily's life and rearranged it. He wanted his child to inherit something, and slowly, without ever quite saying it, he began to want that something to be clean. "I've been thinking," he told her one night in the last month when Emily was so large she couldn't sleep and they stayed up together in the dark, "about what our child inherits, about what I leave behind, and I don't want it to be what I built, not the way I built it." He was quiet for a moment. "You've spent a year making this empire run without blood. What if that wasn't temporary? What if that was the point? What if we spent the next 20 years turning all of this into something our child could inherit without inheriting the graves?" Emily turned to look at him in the dark. "You'd do that, give up what you are." "I don't know if I can give up what I am," Victor admitted, "but I could become something new, the way you did. You showed me it was possible. A person can live in this world with their eyes open and their soul intact. You proved that. Maybe an empire can too. Maybe I could spend whatever years I have left proving it." He found her hand. "I built all of this out of a promise to never be powerless again. I think I'd like to rebuild it out of a different promise, that our child will be powerful enough to be good, that they'll have everything I have and none of what it cost me." And Emily, lying in the dark, understood that she had done something she'd never intended. She'd come into Victor DeLuca's world to be remade by it, and instead, somewhere along the way, she'd begun to remake it. The waitress who'd once observed this world from the outside holding a tray had become the force that was slowly, patiently bending it towards something it had never been. The baby came on a night in early spring. It was long and it was hard, and Emily, who had faced down guns without flinching, was more frightened than she'd ever been in her life, and Victor, who had buried a wife, held her hand through every hour, and did not let go and did not leave and did not once look away. And when it was over, when the exhausted silence finally broke into the thin, furious cry of a newborn, Emily heard Victor DeLuca make a sound she had never heard from any human being, a sound of pure, undefended joy torn out of a man who'd spent 30 years making sure he'd never feel anything that could be taken from him. It was a girl. The nurse placed her in Emily's arms, and Emily looked down at this small, red, outraged creature, this impossible thing she'd fought her own husband's fear to bring into the world, and every plan she'd ever made, every calculation, every carefully architected defense, all of it went silent. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to read, nothing to control. There was only a daughter breathing alive hers. And Emily Carter, who had spent her whole life keeping her mind quiet and her treasure hidden, who had descended into darkness and made herself powerful enough to survive it, wept without any control at all. Victor sat down beside her on the bed. He looked at the child in Emily's arms, and Emily watched him, watched the coldest, most powerful, most guarded man she had ever known reach out one trembling finger and touch his daughter's tiny hand, and watched that hand close around his finger with the blind, absolute trust of the newly born. And Victor DeLuca, who did not weep, wept. "She's holding on," he said, his voice destroyed. "Look, she's holding on to me." "That's what children do," Emily whispered. "I don't know how to do this." He looked at Emily with something like panic. "I know how to run an empire. I know how to make men afraid. I don't know how to—" He gestured helplessly at the tiny hand wrapped around his finger. "How to be trusted like this, how to deserve it." "Neither do I," Emily said. "We'll learn, the way we learned everything else, together." They named her Rosa after the grandmother who had started it all, the woman who'd crossed an ocean with nothing, who'd taught a lonely girl to speak in the language of home, who'd made her promise to keep her treasure hidden from thieves. And Emily looked at her daughter and thought about that promise, and understood finally and completely that she'd both broken it and kept it. She'd broken it because she'd shown her treasure to the world, and the world had not destroyed her. It had bent around her. She'd become powerful precisely by refusing to stay small. And she'd kept it because the treasure had never really been her mind or her languages or her ruthless, clever gift for reading the architecture of people. The treasure had been this, the thing worth protecting, the thing worth becoming powerful enough to defend. Her grandmother had told her to guard her treasure, and Emily had spent years thinking the treasure was the gift itself, when all along the gift had only ever been the guard. The treasure was the small breathing life in her arms, and everything she'd become, all of it, the descent and the darkness and the terrible, clever power, All of it had only ever been the fortress she was building around a child she hadn't yet met. She understood it all now. She understood that this had never been the story people would have assumed from the outside, the story of an innocent waitress taken into a dangerous man's world and consumed by it. That story was a lie. It was the story other people told about women like her, the story that assumed she was something to be taken, something to be swallowed, something that happened to her. That was never what happened. What happened was that a man had looked across a restaurant and said, "I want her," believing he was choosing her, believing he was reaching down to lift a struggling girl into his world. And he had been wrong in the deepest way a man could be wrong. He hadn't taken Emily into his world. He'd opened a door and something far larger than he'd bargained for had walked through it, and by the end she hadn't been absorbed into his empire. She'd remade it, softened it, bent it toward the light, and given it the one thing 30 years of ruthlessness never could, a future worth protecting. She looked at Victor, holding their daughter. Now this dangerous man made gentle, this empire builder undone by a hand smaller than his thumb, and she understood that she had not lost herself in his world. She had conquered it, quietly, completely, without firing a single shot. The waitress who once carried 4 plates on one arm and a secret in her chest was gone, yes. But she hadn't been destroyed, and she hadn't been swallowed, and she hadn't been taken. She had evolved into a lawyer, into a strategist, into a broker of wars and a bender of worlds, into a wife who was her husband's equal, and in the ways that mattered most, his better, into a mother who would raise her daughter to be powerful enough to be good, to have everything, and to owe it to no one, and to never once have to hide her treasure from thieves, because she would be taught from her very first breath to be a fortress unto herself. Emily looked down at little Rosa, breathing her first hours of life in a world of luxury and danger and fierce, uncompromising love, and she made the child a silent promise that she would never have to keep her mind quiet, that she would never have to make herself smaller than she was, that she would grow up knowing exactly how large she was allowed to be, which was as large as she wanted, as large as the whole sky, because her mother had already fought the war that made it safe to be that large and won it. "What are you thinking?" Victor asked, watching her face. Emily smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime, arrived exactly where she was meant to be. "I'm thinking my grandmother was wrong," she said. "She told me to hide what I was because the world takes what it fears. But she never understood the other half of it. The world only takes from you until you become the thing it fears. And then it stops taking, and it starts protecting." She looked up at him. "I stopped hiding the night I spoke Italian in your restaurant. And every single thing that's happened since, the fear, the blood, the choices, I'll never fully forgive myself for all of it, led here, to her." She looked back down at her daughter. "I'd do all of it again, every terrible mile, for this." Victor leaned over and kissed his wife, and then his daughter, and the 3 of them sat together in the quiet of family built impossibly out of 2 people who were never supposed to have one. A woman who'd learned to survive a world she was never meant to enter, and a man who'd learned to love again, a thing he'd never meant to risk. Years from now, Emily knew the story would be told wrong. People would say she was the waitress the Mafia boss took for himself. They would tell it as a story about a powerful man and the ordinary woman he chose. They would never understand the truth. The truth was that Victor DeLuca had looked across a crowded restaurant and thought he was choosing a woman to bring into his world. But that had never been the story. The real story was that an ocean had spent its whole life pretending to be a puddle, and one careless night it had forgotten to pretend, and a powerful man had glimpsed what it truly was and mistaken his glimpse for a choice. Emily Carter was never taken into anyone's world. She was always, from the very first word of Italian to the last breath of that spring night, becoming powerful enough to build her own. And as she held her daughter and watched her breathe, Emily DeLuca finally understood the thing her grandmother had died without ever learning, that the woman who refuses to stay small does not lose herself to the darkness. She becomes the light the darkness learns to fear. 15 years is a long time to keep a promise, and Emily DeLuca had kept every one of hers. The girl who grew up in the house above the city was fearless in a way that sometimes frightened even her mother. Rosa DeLuca was 15 now, and she had her father's dark, steady eyes and her mother's fair Mediterranean skin, and she had inherited something from both of them that neither had planned to pass on a mind that read a room the second she walked into it, and a stubbornness that no locked door had ever survived. She spoke 4 languages by the time she was 10. She had never once in her life been told to make herself smaller. That had been the promise. Emily had made it in a hospital bed looking down at a newborn who gripped Victor's finger with the blind trust of the just arrived, and she had kept it with the same cold, patient determination she'd once used to bend an empire toward the light. Rosa would never hide her treasure. Rosa would grow up knowing exactly how large she was allowed to be, which was as large as the whole sky. And she did. But the world Emily had promised to build around her daughter had not come easily, and it had not come without cost. And on the afternoon this story truly ends, Rosa was about to learn the price of the safety she'd always taken for granted. It happened at the school. Emily had chosen it carefully, a private academy on the Upper East Side, discreet, secure, the kind of place where the children of powerful people learned beside one another and no one asked too many questions. Rosa had gone there since she was 5. She'd never known a moment of danger inside its walls. That was the whole point of it. That was the fortress her mother had spent 15 years reinforcing deal by deal, favor by favor, quietly making certain that no shadow from her world ever fell across her daughters. But the past does not stay buried forever. And on a bright Tuesday in October, a man Emily had crossed long ago sent 3 others to the school gates, and for the first time in 15 years, the fortress was tested. Rosa was walking to the car when she noticed them. She noticed them the way her mother would have, not because they did anything obvious, but because of the thing they were pretending not to feel. 2 men near the corner too, still too casual, watching the school doors, with an attention that didn't fit the street. A third by a parked car, hand resting where a hand doesn't rest by accident. Rosa was 15 years old. She had never been in danger in her life. And in the space of 3 seconds, standing on a sidewalk in the afternoon sun, she understood with absolute clarity that she was in danger now. She did not scream. She did not run. Her mother had raised her without ever quite explaining why to do neither of those things. Instead, Rosa did what 15 years of quiet training had built into her bones. She turned calm and unhurried and walked back toward the school doors as if she'd forgotten something, and the moment she was inside, she found the head of the school's security, a woman named Petra, who had worked for the DeLucas since before Rosa was born, and she said in a voice that did not shake, "There are 3 men outside. They're here for me. Call my mother, now." Petra looked at the girl's face, saw that she was certain, and did not waste a second doubting a 15-year-old. She made the call. Emily was in a meeting downtown when her phone rang. She saw the school's name on the screen, and something ancient and cold woke up inside her, the thing that had been sleeping for 15 years, the thing she'd hoped she would never need again. She answered on the first ring. "Mama." Rosa's voice, steady, too steady. 3 men. Outside the school. I'm inside, I'm safe. Petra's with me. But they're here for me. I know they are. And Emily DeLuca, who had built an empire of peace, who had spent a decade and a half making certain her daughter would never have to be what she'd become, closed her eyes for 1 single second and let herself grieve the promise she'd broken without breaking. Then she opened them, and she was not a mother anymore. She was the woman who sent the message back. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice was calm and absolute. "You did everything right. Everything. Stay inside, stay with Petra. Do not go near a window. I'm coming. And Rosa, I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell me exactly what they look like, exactly where they're standing, and exactly what you noticed that made you sure. Everything. Take your time. Get it right." And Rosa, 15, frightened, standing in a school hallway with her heart pounding, closed her own eyes and did the thing her mother had taught her without ever naming it. She read the architecture. She described all 3 men in precise, unhurried detail. Their positions, their build, the way the one by the car kept touching his jacket, the way the 2 on the corner never looked directly at the doors, but never looked away from them either. And Emily, listening, felt something she had not expected in the middle of her terror. Pride, because her daughter was doing it. The gift Rosa had inherited, the gift Emily's own grandmother had begged her to hide, was working exactly as it should, not buried, not shrunken, but sharp and clear, and saving her life in real time. Rosa was 15, and she had just recognized a professional threat on a quiet street and responded with more composure than most grown men Emily had known. The fortress had not failed. The fortress had held. Because the strongest wall Emily had ever built around her daughter was not the security or the money or the careful arrangements. It was Rosa herself. What happened next happened fast. Emily called Victor, and Victor, 60, now silver all through his dark hair, long retired from the parts of the business that had blood on them, became for one afternoon the man he'd been 30 years ago. He made 3 calls. Within 12 minutes, the 3 men outside the school found themselves quietly surrounded by people who had been watching them since the moment Rosa walked back inside, because Emily DeLuca had never once in 15 years left her daughter's school unwatched. The men were gone before Emily's car even reached the block. No shots, no screaming, no headlines, just 3 professionals discovering too late that they had walked into a fortress 15 years in the making and being escorted very firmly back out of it. The man who'd sent them received a message that evening. Emily wrote it herself. It was 3 sentences long, and it was delivered in a language he understood, and it ended his interest in the DeLuca family permanently. She never told anyone what it said. She never had to. He was never heard from again, not harmed, simply gone the way people went, when Emily DeLuca decided they should no longer be a problem. She had learned long ago that the most permanent solutions rarely required violence. They required only that you understand, a person completely find the thing they were pretending not to feel and hold it up to the light. That night, the 3 of them sat together in the home above the city, Emily, Victor, and Rosa, and for a long time no one spoke. It was Rosa who broke the silence. She was quiet, thoughtful, older suddenly than she'd been that morning. "You knew," she said to her mother. "You knew this could happen someday. That's why you taught me all of it. The languages, the reading people, the staying calm. You never said it was for this, but it was, wasn't it?" Emily looked at her daughter for a long moment. She had always known this conversation would come. She had hoped it would come later. But Rosa had earned the truth today, on a sidewalk with a mind Emily had built to be exactly this strong. "Yes," Emily said. "It was for this. And I'm sorry. I spent 15 years trying to make a world where you'd never need it, and today you needed it anyway." "Don't be sorry." Rosa said it fiercely, and in that moment she looked so much like her mother that Victor had to look away. "You didn't make me weak so I'd be safe. You made me strong so I'd be free. I was never scared out there, Mama. Not really. Because I knew I could handle it. I knew because you taught me I could." She paused. "Grandma Rosa told you to hide what you were. You told me the opposite. You told me to be exactly what I am out loud always. And today that's what saved me." Emily's eyes filled, because there it was, the whole arc of 3 generations laid bare in a single moment. Rosa Carter, who had crossed an ocean and taught a lonely girl to hide her treasure from thieves. Emily, who had learned the hard way that the treasure only became a weakness when it stayed hidden. And now this Rosa named for the first, who had never once been told to be small and who had stood on a sidewalk at 15 and saved her own life because of it. Her grandmother had been trying to protect her granddaughter. Emily understood that now more deeply than ever. Rosa Carter had lived in a world that punished strong women, and she'd done the only thing she knew to keep her Emily safe. She'd taught her to disappear. But she'd been wrong. Not cruel, not foolish, just wrong in the way that frightened people are wrong. The answer had never been to hide the treasure. The answer had been to become powerful enough to keep it. Emily had done that. And she had given her daughter the thing her own grandmother could never give her, a world already conquered, already made safe, already bent into a shape where a girl could be as large as she wanted and no thief could ever take it from her. "I need to tell you something," Emily said, and she took her daughter's hands the way her grandmother used to take hers, the way she'd once taken Victor's face in a study 15 years ago. "About where all of this came from, about who your father and I were before you. You're old enough now. And after today, you've earned it." And so she told her. All of it. The restaurant, the 4 plates, and the secret in her chest. The night she'd forgotten to hide, and the man who'd looked across the room and said 3 words that changed everything. She told Rosa about the descent and the darkness and the choices she'd made that she'd never fully forgive herself for. She told her about the warehouse and the traitor and the night in Little Italy when a boy from her old neighborhood had walked through a door with a gun and she'd used the last thread of her childhood to save everyone in the room. She told her about the promise she'd made in the hospital and the 15 years she'd spent keeping it. Victor listened too, and once or twice he added a piece Emily left out, the way she'd stood up in that room full of killers, the way she'd designed a punishment crueler than murder and called it mercy, the way she'd taken his worst fear and turned it into the reason to be brave. He told his daughter in his quiet, aged voice that her mother was the most dangerous person he had ever known and the most gentle, and that he had spent 30 years being feared by powerful men and had only ever been truly humbled by one waitress who spoke Italian. Rosa listened to all of it, this 15-year-old girl, and when it was done, she was quiet for a long time. "So the story people tell," she said finally. "The one they whisper, that you're the girl Dad took, the waitress the Mafia boss married." She looked at her mother. "It's not true, is it?" Emily smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had waited 15 years to say this to the one person who most deserved to hear it. "No," she said. "It was never true. Your father thought he was choosing me. He thought he was reaching down to lift a struggling girl into his world. But that's not what happened, baby. What happened is that I was an ocean pretending to be a puddle, and one careless night I forgot to pretend, and he caught a glimpse of what I really was, and mistook his glimpse for a choice." She squeezed her daughter's hands. "I was never taken into anyone's world, Rosa. I built my own, and then I built one for you, and today you proved it holds." Victor rose slowly. An old man now, but still with that stillness that had once frozen a restaurant, and he came and stood behind his wife and daughter and put a hand on each of their shoulders. "There's something you should understand," he said to Rosa, "about what your mother did. I built an empire out of fear, out of a promise to never be powerless again. I made men afraid, and I kept everyone I loved at a distance because everything I'd ever loved the world found a way to take." His voice was rough with age and memory. "And then your mother walked in, and she did the impossible. She turned all of it, all that darkness, all that power built out of fear. She turned it into something that could protect a family instead of destroy one. She spent 15 years making it clean enough to leave to you. That's what all of this is now. Not an empire of fear, a fortress of love with you at the center of it. And today, when it was tested, it held, because she made it hold, because you were strong enough to be the last wall of it yourself." Rosa looked up at her father and then at her mother, and something passed between the 3 of them that had no name and needed none. Later that night, after Rosa had gone to bed, checked on twice, the security doubled. The fortress reinforced the way it had been every night for 15 years. Emily stood at the great window high above the city, the same window where she'd once told Victor she felt unafraid, the same window where she'd learned she was pregnant 15 years ago, and walked out into the cold not knowing what to do. Victor came and stood beside her the way he always had. "She's like you," he said. "More than I realized. Today, the way she handled it. That was you. Completely you." "She's better than me," Emily said. "That's the whole point. She never had to become what I became. She never had to lose anything to get strong. She was just allowed to be strong from the beginning. That's the world I wanted to build. One where a girl doesn't have to be broken first." She leaned against him. "My grandmother had to teach me to hide. I had to nearly lose myself to learn to stop hiding, and Rosa just gets to be, from her first breath. She'll never know what it cost to give her that. And I hope she never does." "She knows now," Victor said. "You told her tonight." "I told her the story. She doesn't know the cost, not really. And that's how it should be." Emily looked out at the city she'd once served on aching feet, the city that had almost swallowed her, and instead had crowned her the city that now belonged in all the ways that mattered to the family she'd built out of impossible pieces. The cost was mine to pay. The freedom is hers to keep. That's what mothers do, Victor. We pay in a currency our children never have to see so they can be free in a world we broke ourselves building. Victor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "Your grandmother would be proud of you." Emily smiled, and there were tears in it, but they were the good kind, the kind that come at the end of a long road, when you finally understand where it was always leading. "She'd be proud of Rosa," Emily said. "And that's the same thing, because everything Rosa is my grandmother started on a stoop in Queens, teaching a lonely little girl to speak in the language of home." She wiped her eyes. "She thought she was teaching me to hide. She was really teaching me to survive long enough to stop hiding. And now there's a girl asleep down the hall who'll never have to hide at all. 3 generations. My grandmother crossed an ocean, so that could be true. She just didn't live to see it." They stood together at the window, the woman who had refused to stay small, and the man who had learned to love again, a thing he'd never meant to risk. And below them, the city glittered on indifferent and vast, holding its 10 million secrets, never knowing that one of the most powerful people inside it had once carried 4 plates on one arm and a secret in her chest, and had built out of that secret a fortress no darkness could breach, and a daughter no thief could ever take. The waitress was gone. She had been gone for a long time, but she had not been destroyed, and she had not been swallowed, and she had not been taken. She had become the light the darkness learned to fear. And she had raised a daughter who was born into that light, who had never known a single day of the fear that made it, who had stood on a sidewalk at 15 and read a threat and saved herself, with a mind her great-grandmother had first lit on a stoop in Queens, a daughter who would grow up and grow strong, and someday tell her own children the story of the woman who taught 3 generations that you do not survive the world by making yourself smaller. You survive it by becoming so completely, so fearlessly, so unapologetically yourself that the world has no choice but to bend around you. Emily Carter had learned that the hard way. Her daughter would never have to. And somewhere in whatever comes after, an old woman named Rosa, who had crossed an ocean with nothing at all, finally understood that her granddaughter had not disobeyed her. She had simply finished what Rosa began and made the treasure safe at last.